Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield.
Hey Olivia, nice to be doing the podcast again, albeit with a new host. So great to be here. Been a bit of a week, hasn't it?
Well, it has been a week indeed, yes. So we have seen more Trump news coming down the pipeline for the legal industry. With his following on from Perkins, he's done the same to Paul Weiss. We've had the DEI letters from the EEOC to 20 law firms who have, from the looks of things, taken that very seriously and reacted to it almost immediately. So yeah, a bit of a week to say the least. What are your thoughts on all of this, Michael?
Yeah, lots. Don't know if any of them are right. I think. I mean, I certainly feel like this, but I think the majority of the legal industry feels like this week started sometime in 2023 and is set to end sometime in 2027. It's been like, and it's one of those weeks in which it feels like a decade happened. I don't know. There's a saying about that somewhere. So was it some weeks feel like years and some, yeah. And I can't remember it. It's been a long week, really.
So description. Yeah.
Look, I think what's notable about the Trump targeting of Paul Weiss is that I think it kind of shocked the market. People weren't expecting it. It came out of not nowhere, because obviously it's the third firm that is targeted. And it's pretty serious, right? You have the president of the most powerful country in the world targeting one of the most prestigious U.S. law firms, one of the most prestigious law firms in the world, very specifically saying not just withdrawing security clearances, but also instructing federal agencies to stop working not just with the firm, but also with the firm's clients. I have no idea how practical any of that is. I do not know how legal or otherwise any of that is, but the impact in terms of clients and client work is obviously very significant, even if it turns out not to be viable. And also, in terms of security clearances and federal buildings and all of that, does that mean that the firm's litigators currently can't enter federal court houses? Can they not work there? There seems to be, this is significant. And then you've got, I know he's a firebrand and says a lot of crazy things, but also has a voice in the White House. You have Steve Bannon saying this is an attempt to shut down, to destroy the business of some of these big law firms. And I think somebody wrote an interesting comment piece about, about how people take the Shakespeare line about first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers, as a bit of a joke. People always refer to it as around the unpopularity of lawyers. But in fact, there's a much more serious undertone to that, which is the lawyers are the people that can stop you from upending everything in a system. And if you bring the biggest firms and the best lawyers in your jurisdiction or to heel, then maybe they're not going to stop you from breaking the system and upending and disrupting everything, which is what appears to be, happening to an extent in the US. So there is also that. So it's kind of it's extraordinary. It's a genuinely extraordinary, and I think it needs to be seen to some extent in that latter context, not just a vendetta, not just a personal vendetta against law firms he doesn't like. There does seem to be also almost a, that judges and law firms, some of them have been thorns in Trump's side, etc. But in terms of the rule of law and enacting and keeping rule of law and separation of powers and all of this stuff, all of these very long-standing constitutional things, which generally I think the world thinks quite sensible and good things, but should stay. The legal industry and the legal sector are the custodians and guardians of all of that, and so scaring the hell out of them and threatening them and disrupting their businesses is probably a great way to go about minimizing challenges to your attempts to disrupt things. So yeah, it's I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I think it's extraordinary.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that there's got to be a plan here, right? I think that the staggered nature that he's doing it in is kind of, there's something to it. So where does it end? How many law firms are there that are going to be that are going to be targeted? We have a rough list, but will he go for all of them? Where does it end? Does he then go for judges that stand in his way? We saw last week that, one of the judges said it sent shivers down his spine. Where is it going to end? And what is the ultimate plan? As you say, is it to just dismantle anything that can stand in his way? Where's the rule of law there? How is that constitutional? There's so many massive questions that, are ethical questions at the end of the day and are quite philosophical that are being asked. And I think that people really need to, I know that people in the legal universe are worried about it, but I think it needs to be a bigger sort of concern for the public, because this is huge, as you say. This is, where will it end? And just on the back of that, we've also got the DEI letters from the EEOC to 20 law firms this week. 9 have already taken DEI out of their sort of policy, what's the word I'm looking for here? Statements online. They've taken out DEI. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it fits into this broader picture of scaring and disrupting big law on the grounds that many of the others will follow. There is obviously, I think there are many people who would say certain aspects of DEI policies were imperfect in some respects, may have gone too far, but swinging the pendulum away from it completely, the reason why there are DEI policies, and it's a big issue and has been a big cause in law, is because it has historically been a profession with a problem regarding diversity, whether that is, privilege, whether that is, lack of ethnic diversity, whether that's a relative lack of gender diversity, or whether there have been improvements. The reason why it's not because law is so unbelievably woke, or to use the term pejoratively. It's because there genuinely have been issues with historically a lack of diversity, hence the embracing of initiatives to begin to address that over the past decade have been important. And have they succeeded in every regard? No. Have they made some progress? Yes. But to do away with any kind of reference to, or to almost brand as some kind of insidious evil, the fact that firms are trying to increase diversity is again kind of extraordinary. The length, the tone of the letters, some of them where there are, I don't know, there's maybe 15 of the letters which are kind of all the same, and there's about 5. I won't name the firms, but there are about 5 which are very personal, like screenshots of policies on websites, references to things having been deleted, references to public statements made in the past. There's at least 5 firms that are really specifically singled out, even more than everybody else. And the tone is fairly kind of outrageous, and the amount of information that's being asked for is also extraordinary. I don't know how those firms, and if those firms are engaging in terms of, I'm sure they're gathering the information of that's being asked for, whether Whether they will all feel compelled to send it or will challenge the letters and requests beforehand first, I don't know. I mean, it like I said, we're in relatively unprecedented territory here, and it's very, very difficult. It puts leaders of firms in a complete bind because they have a duty to protect their business, but also they're facing obviously very divided opinions internally, and having to address the issue that compliance requires them to completely backtrack on many policies that they've introduced, statements that they have made, commitments they have made to their people. And I don't know what clients make of all of this. Again, there will be divisions on the client side of things as well, because clients are also on a spectrum where some may be, yeah, it all went a bit too far. We've been getting rid of our own policies, etc. But it is complicated by the fact that, and whether this was part of a plan or coincidental, I don't know. But US big tech has been driving the economy in the last decade, really. And if you go back 10 years, West Coast big tech was very much not Republican, very much was very pro DEI, very liberal, and there are aspects of that that have flipped with big tech leaders of the biggest ones largely falling in line with a lot of the Trump agenda and doing away with their own DEI policies, etc. So that sets a tone where some of these firms' biggest clients have been reversing course in this regard already. So, and there is obviously a strong tendency to follow clients. There will be other clients who think this is awful, etc. But so I think that lots and lots of things are up in the air. It's notable that firms haven't really been commenting, which I think seems sensible from a PR perspective. And at the same time, there does need to be a degree, for firms that are making changes, a degree of transparency would seem to be wise as to what they are doing, and some kind of rationale internally, at least for their people, even if they feel unable to comment externally at this time. Because otherwise you're not going to at all satisfy those internal voices, and there does need to be there does need to be some dialogue around this. Executive orders from the top to just delete content under cover of darkness at a weekend or whatever is not necessarily brave leadership.
No.
And at the same time, this is incredibly difficult to balance like the weight of the last 10 years and direction of travel with a new environment and the need to, first and foremost, protect the business that you run. And at the same time, if the rule of law is undermined or hollowed out sufficiently, do you have a business? So that's I don't think we're quite there yet, but
Yeah.
you're not going to have a business if if you don't also protect the rule of law. So it's very hard, and I don't know to what extent this is planned. I would say that under Trump in the first term, it was chaos. People didn't know what they were doing. It was. I don't think there was a plan. Clearly there's been a lot of thought in certain respects as to what is going on, and a lot, but it's unclear what is planned and what is on the hoof and what is on the fly, so to speak. But some smart people have done a lot of thinking about how to disrupt things, how to disrupt the system in the US, and it has been planned. To what extent the developments as regards the legal sector are part of that plan, and what falls into more of a sort of a personal vendetta and a general dislike of DEI, I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows, but it is completely unprecedented.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got a few of the sort of rebrands that law firms have made since the letters have come out. I won't mention the firm specifically, but instead of DEI, we now have welcoming environment, belong as you are. We have some of the titles of people's roles have been shifted, so it's no longer, managing partner of DEI, it's now managing partner of inclusion, or, just inclusion itself. So we're seeing that shift that's happening pretty quickly. And as you said, almost under the cover of darkness. And there is a question here about the PR side of that as well, because that's huge. And I am kind of going to ask you a bit of an off the cuff question. It's reminded me of your panel in Mexico, Michael, at the IBA conference, which was basically saying how political should law firms get, and where is the line. And I know that it's such a controversial topic. I think you did a poll that it was pretty divided, right? 50-50 up the middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thank you for the reminder again. That feels like a very different time. But with the consensus from that discussion was that law firms largely shouldn't wade into politics and social issues too much, but where the rule of law itself is threatened, must stand up and have a voice and fight for the rule of law itself. And that was pretty clear. And that was, thank you for reminding me of it. And that was, there were participants in that discussion from a range of jurisdictions, many of which have not had to the same extent. The culture wars may not be as open. Law firms haven't made big statements about different social environments and topics in the same way that maybe they did in recent years in the UK or in the US. But even in most jurisdictions, they were like, yeah, we think it's kind of ridiculous that law firms have got into the habit of sort of commenting on every social issue going. But when the rule of law itself is threatened, you have to fight, because that is what you do, that is what you stand for, that is what you are. And I think that's kind of interesting, because we're clearly in and around that kind of territory in the US, where there is very much an assault on aspects of the rule of law itself, and trying to make trying to increase the executive power and make the rule of law subservient to that. And you've seen that with the attacks on the judiciary, lawyers, etc. So we are in protect the rule of law territory, and that would suggest that law firms do have a duty to protect the rule of law, and that includes that will include at times making public statements. I think. But it is also extremely difficult territory, because there is also the business to protect, and you have this assault on multiple fronts, where the executive orders themselves, law firms are both incredibly resilient and extremely fragile at the same time. It does not take a huge amount of financial disruption to cause this sort of a cascade of consequences, where if a firm is severely impacted financially, partners suddenly leave, and then you have worse impact because you don't have the talent. And when it spirals fast. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And it is very strange that firms have a very resilient model, but it is also fragile in certain respects, because they are profitability machines. But if you disturb big law at the top end is an absolute machine when it comes to profitability, and at the same time doing something, you need a lot of firepower to disturb that and disrupt that. But if you do disturb and disrupt it sufficiently, fragility comes into play. So there is that. This is not just words. This is there are certainly the executive orders have the potential to be economically severely damaging. The letters not as much in that, but you put the two together, and this is where it comes back to the question, without wishing to get conspiracy theory about this, whether or not this has been quite carefully planned,
Yes.
or whether it's just, I don't know, personal and chaotic. It feels quite planned.
I think so. I agree with that completely. I think it feels planned, the timing of it all, there's no way that it's off the cuff, in my opinion. I guess moving on now back to sort of Europe and Herbert Smith Freehill's fines from the UK regarding Russia sanctions breach. Didn't see that one coming either. It really has been a hell of a week. Over to you, Michael. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was quite surprised. I mean, obviously, we're talking. It literally came out this morning.
Yes.
So still absorbing this one a little bit. I think that the firm has clearly done the right thing in. There would have been a lot of chaos during the time, again, in what feels like a different century, when Russia invaded Ukraine and law firms were pulling out of Moscow and closing down their Russia operations, and that period of weeks would have been insanely chaotic and difficult as firms were working out what to do, and they were trying to work out what to do for their people, trying to work out what to do for their clients. Then you've got sanctions coming into force, which were all happening at the same time. You had a huge amount of media pressure, client pressure, and it is inevitable that, as HSF say in their statement, human error is completely inevitable in that period. And as a law firm, and I think other businesses, not if a company isn't regulated or whatever, or not a law firm, maybe wasn't aware of the obligations to the same extent, may not have known they breached sanctions, or may not have known that they or may not have had an obligation to self-report. As a law firm, as a leading law firm, you do not have those choices. You are aware. You are generally going to become aware of if you've got something wrong legally, and as a regulated law firm, the assumption is that you comply with the law, so you have a much higher standard to hold yourself to than most other businesses. And so they clearly did the right thing by self-reporting promptly and cooperating fully, and that brought the fine down. And it doesn't change the fact that they inadvertently did not comply with the law.
Exactly.
And so I think it certainly will have raised eyebrows. It's certainly unexpected, and it's also clear that the firm, apart from making the mistake in the first place, has at all stages done the right thing, and thus I don't think the reputational harm will be lasting.
No.
It's more of a, wow, wasn't expecting that. But if you actually read it closely, that it was during a time of complete chaos, human error. They did the right thing, and they've cooperated throughout, and they've taken their medicine, and they had no real choice as soon as they identified that they had made mistakes here, because they're a big law firm, and to try to cover it up, to not report something that you'd become aware of would have become would have been far worse than to deal with this, and to deal with an extremely painful day of coverage. And a fine which is, I mean, it's financially immaterial to a firm.
It's not that much.
It's more of a publicity. But
Exactly.
apart from the original mistake, they have handled it appropriately and taking their medicine. And you do wonder whether there are some other firms in the pipeline, perhaps, or maybe there are some other firms that are looking at this and thinking, do we need to? Did we get everything right here? And I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if any other firms get fined, but it would be unfair for HSF to have their reputation significantly damaged for doing the right thing in the difficult circumstance of admitting human error and paying the price.
Well, look, it kind of raises the question of, HSF did the right thing and it came clean, but are there other firms that maybe haven't yet that could maybe be panicking a little bit off the back of this news? Is there more to come? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think there'll be a few firms that are maybe. It depends, first of all, if Ofsted have if there are other investigations or other things to come out about other firms who may have self-reported similarly following mistakes, and there may be some who aren't quite certain if they got it right or not. But maybe I'm not sure this would call. I think if a firm knows that it got it wrong and hasn't reported it, that would be kind of problematic. But there'll be many. I don't think it suggests that firms should reopen everything and look, did we comply with everything? It's more if there is a firm of any significant size that knows it didn't get it right but hasn't reported, then that would be an issue because because these things have a way of getting out eventually.
Exactly. And I mean, kind of within the same category here, I'm going to throw in the controversial client situation because, a lot of law firms had Russian clients that they decided to not work alongside anymore during that time. And there has been something that's come out about sort of firms taking on questionable clients and sort of, is that the right thing to do? I mean, someone's got to take them. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, obviously, I think for the previous things that we've been talking about, we haven't referenced specific articles because every legal publication going has been writing about the Trump executive orders and the EEOC letters, and there's lots of coverage today about the HSF fine regarding sanctions. This one's a little bit more specific. This is a Legal Futures piece for Neil Rose, published today in Legal Futures, quoting Guy Beringer, the former senior partner for Mellon and Overy. And speaking at an event at the House of Parliament, Anti-Corruption and Responsible Tax Group. And Guy leads a task force which has been focused on how firms take on new clients, and particularly clients that are associated with kleptocracy. Again, this is interesting because we have a world now where in the US, the anti-kleptocracy unit of the Department of Justice has been explicitly wound down, or is explicitly being wound down. So it's everything we thought we knew, we no longer know, in terms of the way the world works. So that's a separate issue. Over here, there is no such move at this point. We'd still generally see kleptocracy as a bad thing. I think just as an aside, I do think that it might be a net negative globally, but I do think that the stuff that's going on in the US right now may be a net positive for London and the UK more broadly in terms of, diversity is not a banned word. Rule of law, we're pretty committed to staying the course here. We have a prime minister who is a lawyer, and we generally see corruption, kleptocracy, etc., as continue to see them as generally bad things. But this task force is due to issue its report, I think, next month, and I think they're not saying that there needs to be legislation or anything like that. I don't think, but there should be more focus and firms management having credible explanation of why a client is wealthy or has money to pay their fees, etc., and the judgments need to. This is where the PR comes into play, I suppose. The judgments that firms, the commercial decisions that commercial law firms make about their client choices must be ones that those firms are prepared to defend publicly. And that is, and that sort of is something which cannot be just hidden behind secrecy or client confidentiality, etc. And firms should be accountable to some extent for their client choices, with the exception, of course, for criminal defense work, where no lawyer should ever be criticized for defending somebody accused of criminal acts. But when it comes to commercial work, firms make commercial decisions, and that being prepared to justify your decision, I think is interesting. So anyway, this report is coming out next month. No doubt we will take the opportunity to discuss it in more detail once we've seen the findings next month, and we'll see how those findings sit with current global narrative around things like kleptocracy, and have a good discussion once we've seen what the report says.
Absolutely. And I suppose just before we wrap up here, we've got Kirkland and Ellis's revenue surged to 8.8 billion, PEP jumps to 16%. So far, Kirkland is the highest revenue of the year, which is kind of expected, I'd say. Yeah, what do you agree?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've clearly been around for too long. I remember being at Baker McKenzie when I think we reached 3 billion. Oh, I can't remember. I remember when we were briefly the biggest law firm in the world by revenue, and I don't know, about 10 years ago. And then since that time, and then immediately Kirkland and Latham's just shot past and kept on shooting. And those two firms in particular, I think that the numbers feel like massive by legal sector standards. But Paul Hodkinson from law.com did a great piece, actually. Did a great piece on how, in the context of professional services more broadly, it's not a big number. When you think about the much bigger numbers that say McKinsey or the Big Four make, where you'll be talking about, but McKinsey is still more than double what the revenues of Kirkland and Ellis, and then you're talking about several multiples higher. We're still talking about 8 or 9 times higher for Big Four. So the law firms will continue to be relatively small fry. It's kind of crazy. Relatively, a firm making like 8 billion or 7 billion being like small fry by the biggest professional services standard sounds kind of nuts, but it is true. They are enormous by law firm standards, but they are not big businesses by global standards. And I think that context is important to bear in mind. Kirkland has done fantastically well, and we have a tendency to be impressed by big numbers, and we have a tendency to think of big numbers in the context of the industry in which we work, and they are massive numbers in the context of the industry in which we work. There is no doubt about that, and Kirkland and Latham's and many of the top firms, they are powerhouses that do exceptional work and have exceptional talent and have really brought into focus pricing power And in terms of the role of the lawyer on private equity deals, in bankruptcy and restructuring work, as being really critical to deal making and being able to price their services accordingly, is incredibly impressive. And they've married that up to changes to their business models, to massed ranks of salary partners fighting it out to become fabulously wealthy by making equity, and in the case of Kirkland, well done to them. And we work in a legal sector. We want it to be healthy, strong, thriving, and financially successful, right? And so well done to Kirkland, incredibly impressive operation. And I think it underlines them, and Latham and a few others. It underlines how the role of the law firm and the lawyer has been elevated in certain types of high value work, and the pricing power increased accordingly. Will every year be like that? I don't know, but long may they continue to thrive.
Exactly. And as you say, the role that we have to play in all of that as well, in sort of disseminating information and making sure that law firms and their work is featured in the media. I think that all ties in quite nicely to it. So yes, I suppose, as you say, long live that reign, because we're also in the mix. But yeah, I mean,
I wouldn't say that, but I think we all, as we partner with and a supplier to law firms, so we want them to succeed. Yes, 100%. I wouldn't quite put us in the same category
no,
as
not
big
quite.
law.
Not yet, Michael. Not yet.
Give it 5 years.
Exactly. Never say never. But yeah, I mean, it's been a great discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's been great to hear your insights. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Olivia. Look forward to next time.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Michael.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast, brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.